Very much all of you for joining us this afternoon and sharing perhaps your lunchtime. I think you're going to really enjoy, hopefully, seeing some of these sites and my own personal journey into examining this area. And I'm going to start off here with my PowerPoint here. Today we're going to be talking about West Central Colorado, and I'll show you a little bit further what that area is. We're going to talk a little bit about the history of the archaeology that happened in this particular area, so hopefully you'll get a good context of that. You'll also see a little bit of how these collections that I initially started looking at, how those became re-examined and how it influenced future researchers. And then finally at the end, I'll kind of look at all of the theoretical implications of the research as it is currently understood in this area, and areas in which I see new avenues for continued research. And then finally, we'll kind of talk about how there's this great need to look at collections like this in greater detail. So, but before I begin, I would like to just state a land acknowledgement. In the spirit of healing and education, we acknowledge the 48 contemporary tribes with historic ties to the state of Colorado. These tribes are our partners. We consult with them as we plan exhibits, collect, preserve, and interpret artifacts, do archaeological work, and create educational programs. We recognize these indigenous peoples as the original inhabitants of this land. I hope that through this presentation, and I'm going to turn off my video here. I can do that. Might need some help with that. If I can turn off my video. Stop video. There we go. I hope you'll be able to see that reanalysis of artifact collections can provide new perspectives to archaeological problems. So how did this all start? Well, for me, it all started with a project and some questions. It really started as a real paradox. While working at History Colorado, then known as Colorado Historical Society, under the Information Management Division, I came across a particular site, 5MN 191, known as the Paradox site, that we had one site form for, that had a lot of intriguing information, a lot of missed data or missing data in our database. And it talked about this particular site with a sequence of occupation from Ute, Fremont, Pueblo, and Basket Maker. And this particular site form was filled out by a gentleman named Dr. Hiri Vondershek, which I'll talk a little bit more about later, from Metro State College. But he also made reference to earlier excavations done by a couple, George and Edna Woodbury, from the State Historical Society of Colorado, which is our predecessor's name at History Colorado. So this was very intriguing. It opened up the possibility that we needed to, or I could find information that could be put into our database and also into our archive collection that could make it more complete and have a complete record at the Office of Archaeology and Historic Preservation. So that's where it all started. It all started way back in 1997 as I began this, this quest, and it really was a quest. The chase was really on looking at this, and I really wanted to answer some questions that I had related to it as well. Not only to try to gather the data and make sure that it was available, but also some real questions as to what were the cultural affiliations and so forth. That eventually led to a published article in Southwestern Lore, the journal for the Colorado Archaeological Society, which you might be able to find a copy of at your local library. And from there, it led to a lot of other theoretical debates and new research in the area. And I really can't help but not emphasize that this area has so much rich archaeological information that it still has so much that we can learn from that's there. To help orientate you, I've got this very general map that I produced a while ago to show you what area of Colorado we're talking about. And when I say West Central Colorado, I'm really talking about far west Colorado and sort of that centralized region, the sort of area that you see in, outlined in red. We're going to be talking a little bit about some other sites as well in this conversation and this discussion, this presentation today. Most importantly, the Paradox Valley site areas that you see, they're very close to the edge of Utah, as well as the Cottonwood Creek area, which is a little bit further east. I won't be talking, it's not shown on this map, but we'll be talking a little bit about Pueblo, Tabwatch Creek, which is kind of an area in between the two areas. And then further north, we have other known sites that are really known by the Fremont, the Canyon Pintado area, which I won't be talking about, but a well-known area further north. And then Dinosaur National Monument, we'll be briefly talking about that. There's other sites in Utah that are Fremont known. The 9 Mile Canyon is well known. Range Creek is also close to that area. I'll also be talking a little bit about Glen Canyon, which is an area kind of, again, further south, up above the Colorado River area. And then the Grand Staircase Escalante National Monument, I'll be briefly mentioning that as well. But most importantly, we'll be also talking about the Mesa Verde area, which is further south of this area and the heartland of the ancestral Puebloans and the Canyons of the Ancient National Monument, if you're familiar with that as well. Well, this area has really a deep history that actually goes back to its earliest known first recording from non-Indigenous peoples back in 1776, and the Franciscan Friars, Dominguez and Escalante, while they were camping at the mouth or at the juncture of the San Miguel rivers and the Dolores rivers, noted in their chronicles that there was a ledge upon which there were ruins of a small and ancient pueblo whose houses appear to have been made of stone, with which the Utah Tabwachis had made a weak and crude fortification. So this actually is one of the very earliest non-Indigenous recordings of archaeological sites. Very interesting. And I think it's also important to note a couple of things in that quote. One, that the Franciscan Friars identified this particular site as being similar to the ancient Pueblos. They talk about it as being small and ancient Pueblo, assumingly that that's probably in relationship to their knowledge of some of the Puebloan structures that they had encountered further south, as well as current occupied Pueblos in New Mexico. And then they also notes the Utah Tabwachis, particular brand of Utes that were occupying the area and were kind of reusing those reoccupying those sites. So kind of an interesting note that they had made about the area. I'm going to jump about 150 years past that, and the very first scientific investigations, however, took place by Drs. Jean Aller Jensen and Frank H. Roberts in 1924, also from the State Historical Society of Colorado. So Jensen and Frank H. Roberts were actually on a mission to trace the northern periphery of the ancestral Puebloans, as they were known, as we know them now. And they had heard rumors and stories that there were ruins in the Paradox Valley. And so they made their way to this location and found and did some testing at the site. They spent 3 days at the site and did some excavations, and they found an enormous amount of interesting materials. I just want to mention that Frank H. Roberts, this was really probably his first professional career. Frank H. Roberts, for those who may know, went on to an illustrious career as the head of ethnology and archaeology at the Smithsonian Institution, and did a lot of work later at, of course, at the Lindenmeyer site, which is one of the first earlier Paleo-Indian sites here in the Front Range foothills area of Colorado. And so he did a lot of work first here with the State Historical Society of Colorado. He also did a nice profile of one of the excavation units they did. Although their notes indicate that they did limited testing. And they suggested that they were going to be doing a return trip. By the way, all of this information was never ever published, although we do have a manuscript of it and all of their other journeys into other sites along this particular expedition at History Colorado Today in our library. Now, Jenkin and Roberts suggested that this area was indeed the northern fringe of the ancestral Puebloans, and they thought that these were field houses or perhaps summer villages. And that perception kind of persisted. As I mentioned, they suggested that they were going to do a return trip. Fortunately, both Jenkin and Roberts left the Historical Society. And so the next bit of researchers that would come in to investigate this area were the couple, George and Edna Woodbury, in 1931. They were the newly appointed curators of archaeology at what was then known as History Colorado. And they had took up the notes left by Jenkin and Roberts and thought that they would perhaps follow in their footsteps and their suggestions and continue to do more excavations in the Paradox Valley. They received some funding from the Smithsonian Institution to do this particular investigation. And again, they were really, the whole effort was to really determine the furthest northern extent of Pueblo culture. George and Edna Woodbury were very, very good archaeologists from their time. George had his PhD from, I think, the University of Vienna, and he did a lot of work in Palestine or Near Eastern area of Europe, or of Asia, I should say. And they brought in plane tables. They did a lot of, what we would consider modern archaeology techniques. They do have left us with some pretty good field notes as well, which is very helpful. Although some of their precision is not what we would consider adequate for today's standards. They did leave us with a lot of photos as well of their excavations, with not a whole lot of interpretation behind it, however. There was, in fact, as you can kind of see from this and looking, at and analyzing it today, we can sort of see that there was a lot of different constructions, a lot of different room blocks, and a lot of walled areas architecture-wise, and a lot of different artifacts. They found a lot of Southwestern style ceramics, and these are some of the examples here. All but the handle with the anthropomorphic design was collected and is at the History Colorado today. Earl Morris actually was invited to come visit them and did look at these ceramics on his visit, and did determine in his mind that they were very similar in stylistic design to the ancestral Puebloan cultures in the Mesa Verde area. So this reemphasized the whole idea that this was perhaps the northernest extent of the ancestral Puebloan area. I did actually have the opportunity way back in 1997 when I was giving a talk at the Colorado Council of Professional Archaeologists to have some of these ceramics reanalyzed by David Bredernitz, who is was a well-known ceramic researcher, and he also said that these look like they were P1, P2 wares, very similar to some of the things that he was finding in the Cortez area of, in the Mesa Verde area. Some other artifacts that we do have at History Colorado as well are some very unusual gaming pieces, bone tools, which are very interesting, and a real huge assortment of what we call grayware shards as well, or ceramic shards. As I mentioned, they did keep really good field notes for their day, but provenance was a bit of a problem. So for those of you who are from the museum field, you probably are very familiar with provenance, but we're talking here about provenience, which archaeologists use more extensively. And we're talking about the exact area in which we find artifacts. And with these, a lot of these old collections, if you ever have the opportunity to do research with these very old collections that lack a lot of the precision detail that we collect today, it makes it very challenging. One way that I tried to address this was to lay out sort of visually where they were mentioning in their field notes different features and then different artifacts, and trying to correlate the two. It's not precise, it is only relative, but at least it gives us a little bit of an idea as to where these particular artifacts were found. So it really helps with our provenience issues. So good field notes really help, but you can do some analysis or do some greater degree of finding out where things are if you do a little bit of manipulating and looking at the data. So let's go back to the map for a moment, and we're going to try to now talk a little bit more about that Cottonwood Creek area. And in particular, as you can see, it's just a further east, some of the early efforts done by Western State College and a gentleman known as C.T. Hurst, Clarence Thomas Hurst, who really is also a real giant in terms of Colorado archaeology. C.T. Hurst is the founder of the Colorado Archaeological Society. And he did a number of investigations starting in 1941 through about 1949. Unfortunately, he died in 1949 in this particular area. And he actually received funding from the very prestigious American Philosophical Society to do a lot of this work. I love this picture of C.T. Hurst, and if we could probably actually have met the man, I'm sure that he was quite a character. But as you can see by this photo, it says, 1941 field expedition, visitors welcome, and there's Dr. Hurst with his pipe. I'm not so sure that really looks all that welcoming, but nevertheless, he really did pave the way in terms of the research here in this area. I'll be talking a lot about the 1947 excavations at Cottonwood Plebo here in a bit, but he did a lot of work, as I mentioned, in this whole area. And some of his most important work happened to be some of the cave sites also in this area, two of which are really key and important, probably the most important, which is the Cottonwood Cave area. Here we have really some of the earliest maize, dated maize, anywhere in North America. And it was found in a bundle, that picture that you see on the right, and was recently, well, I should say recently, but 20 years ago, carbon-14 dated to 389 to 170 BCE. So really, really early maize. And we also, associated with that in this area is a lot of what we call basket maker iconography. There in the center, you can see a picture of, kind of in the tan picture there in the middle, a circular figure that looks sort of like a keyhole. That's been interpreted by some rock art researchers like Sally Cole to represent perhaps the pendants that are found at basket maker sites. So basket maker is really, the basket maker 2 culture is the very earliest foundational agricultural culture in the Southwest, for those not unfamiliar. And they pretty much spread from basically two areas, the Durango area and also further in Utah, up further north, carrying with them, most likely, this maize agriculture. How much they actually adopted initially, we're not sure, but they did have this with them, and we see this at a number of different sites. Glen Canyon is another example where you see a real tracing of these early basket maker folks. A little bit different on that, but a similar lifestyle also noted on the eastern side, or what we call Western Colorado. So there's this very, very early presence of Southwestern influence in this particular region. As I mentioned, C.T. Hurst did a number of excavations. This happens to be the Tabwatch Pueblo, and he also did the Cottonwood Plebo as well, which are really amazing architectural sites that have this sort of loosely stacked masonry on walls, and they are very intriguing and very interesting. And as you can see, the precision of the architectural elements isn't quite like you would see in the Mesa Verde area, but nevertheless, very impressive architectural manifestations, although much smaller than anything you would see in the Mesa Verde area. There's another shot from C.T. Hurst's excavations at Cottonwood. This is sort of a circular type structure on your left, and on your right, they found a large number of Matadas, which I think is very interesting and very important, I think, as well, signifying that this particular location may have been really important to food processing. And finally, just for fun, C.T. Hurst was really the true expedition archaeologist, in my opinion. He really lived that life, and that's really shown by the photographs of his field camps. Here you can see C.T. Hurst working diligently at his office out in the field, where he is diligently doing his paperwork. And the field camps, which really look like something you might find out in the Serengeti of East Africa, were real field camps. And so it's really kind of fun and unique, and looking at these old photos to see how it was once done back in the day. Now we're going to jump back. There was a large hiatus of work after C.T. Hurst's death. And then the next really substantial work done in this area was by San Diego State University in 1970. Dr. Larry Leach led most of this work. And unfortunately, the artifacts and the field notes, unfortunately, all got burned up in a fire. And so the only thing that was left were these photographs, which I was able to obtain and make and actually duplicate for our records. But again, it shows really an extensive amount of excavations that San Diego State undertook, and very similar architectural features, very similar to what we had seen from Jenkin and Roberts and Woodbury, and here again with San Diego State over at the Paradox Valley site. And not only that, but they also found, very intriguingly, and most importantly, I think, is a whole sequence of architectural progression, or underlying and then overlying construction sequences. The very earliest is this stone-lined pit house, which is very, very intriguing, and also a lot of colored hearths in the centers of some of these structures. When you kind of map out too where they were in a different area really than the Woodbury's and Jensen's excavations. So they're kind of further on the eastern side of the site versus where they were. So there isn't, these were new areas. And these pit house area is very, very intriguing, because it's almost like someone had taken a pit house from the Grand Staircase Escalante area and plopped it here. It's that similar. You do see the wood beams, probably perhaps this structure was burned at one time. We're not sure. A lot of this is just speculation because we don't have those field notes. But it is very interesting in all respects to see the similarities, leading them, their leech and his students, to really postulate that this was like all the Fremont sites that they had known about in eastern Utah. So, and then the only, I should say that the only published work from Larry Leach's work was done by Janice Casper, and she did some faunal analysis of the site, but that's it. That's all it's ever, and then one published article in Southwestern Lore. We jumped then to the 1974-1975 era. Metropolitan State College revisited this site. This was Dr. Harry Vonderscheck. As I mentioned earlier in the talk about the documentation that we had on file. He filled out this site form, and really we didn't have much about their excavations either. There was one student, Kathy Crane. She did an MA thesis on this particular area, and she reanalyzed some of the ceramics, which I'll talk about in a minute. But basically, just a side note with Hurry and his forays into this area of Colorado, it actually spurred a whole ethics debate within the Colorado Council of Professional Archaeologists, and eventually he lost his professorship at Metro. But really intriguing, these particular photographs were sent to me by Kathy later on, and they show some of the work that they had done at the site. They also excavated another site just north of Paradox, but still in the same general location. Rock Creek is the next valley to the north of Paradox. And here is a very intriguing structure that sort of has 8 contiguous rooms surrounded by this large boulder. And when they excavated the site, Metro found an enormous amount of ceramics. Kathy typologized the ceramics into Uinta grayware, emery grayware, and emery corrugated. And it's really important to note the emery corrugated here, and I'll mention this further. But this really sort of signifies, again, a real further Western influence, particularly from the heartland Fremont area of Utah into Colorado. Okay, so we had all of that history that I had sort of gathered, and I tried to make some sense of what was going on and to try to drive some inquiry in the future about what could perhaps be some avenues of new research for my publication. So one of the things that I have always been intrigued about is architecture and architectural change. And I came up with a scheme based upon all of the work that had been done at Paradox, looking at a change from pit house to Pueblo, which is the same type of change that you see in the Mesa Verde heartland, but here at a condensed version. So I felt pretty good about the dates and the typology of the changes that were going on, and I think it holds together pretty true. But however, that being said, I think there is a lot of possibilities for cultural interaction that may have changed or influenced certain typologies. Nevertheless, that was really one of the main points of my publication, and it has spurred some continued research, I think. Well, as you can see, the cultural affiliation was also a big part of this too, and you know, who are these people, and what could we call these folks? And there has been debate about, you know, should we even have cultural affiliation sometimes in archaeology? And I'll just have this quote for you, because Phil Geib did a lot of research in the Glen Canyon area, also an area in which they had ancestral Puebloan, Fremont, local indigenous area occupation. And it's just sort of a real hard mess trying to figure out anything. And likewise, I think with Glen Canyon, I think it's really evident that in order for us to move forward theoretically and with a better understanding of this area, we really have to achieve a fuller understanding of these cultural identities and social identities and these cultural traditions. And wherever to make good sense of it. So I agree with that sentiment, and I carry that forward here to West Central Colorado as well. Back in 2000, but that's like 20 years ago now, Ken Bedingfield and I actually revisited a lot of these sites, and we came across some really interesting things. One of which was this rock art panel found at the Cottonwood Plebo site, which we didn't really find any other field notes or anyone that had noticed it before. And it's very interesting to me because it doesn't show necessarily any ancestral Puebloan affiliations or iconography. It doesn't show really any Fremont iconography either, but sort of is in the line of sort of an indigenous general LaSalle, Bajo LaSalle style, which probably signifies, at least to me, that we're talking perhaps about indigenous groups coming into this area and being influenced by groups further south in the Mesa Verde area. In a way, it sort of led me to think that perhaps we're talking about a subject that a lot of archaeologists are kind of afraid to talk about, which is called aculturation, or peripheral areas that mimic what you see in other areas. A good example, or an analogy that may be a bit extreme, but let's take, for example, Athens, Greece, in Europe, and then Macedonia up north of it. Initially, the Macedonian area didn't have the attributes that the Athenian cultures did. But eventually, because it was so much trade interaction, it became really more Athenian-like over time. And that's the birthplace of Alexander the Great and his spread of Greek culture across Europe. Now, by no means is my analogy perfect here, but what is important, I think, to understand is that I think here we're seeing that influence. We're seeing emulation. We're seeing trade. We're seeing all of this perhaps going on in this West Central Colorado area, which makes it really intriguing for theoretical and scientific investigations in this part of Colorado. So this is some photos of Cottonwood Plebo, again, about 20 years ago, but you can see that circular structure that C.T. Hurst excavated initially, what it looked like 20 years ago. Lots and lots of debris from the architectural rooms all scattered across the site. And really intriguing, one particular room that, by my interpretation, looks very similar to a plaza area. As a matter of fact, the similarities are striking. If you've ever been to Fremont State Park, there's a site called Five Finger Ridge, and they have, there was known to be a plaza area there. I'm not sure, do we have something similar here in West Central Colorado? This particular room had lots of what we call bedrock Matadas, of the base ground stone area. So they were grinding a lot of food sources in this particular area. Is it a plaza? I'm not sure. It's very intriguing. I think we still need to do a lot more research to know for sure the functionality of some places like this. We also visited the Rock Creek site. That picture that's a little bit hard to see, but that boulder area also had a lot of pecking on it. Again, they were probably doing a lot of food processing on that particular boulder. There was stacked masonry around it. Very intriguing, very interesting. As you can see, there was lots of tumble down walls in this area. And these are the remnants of those structures that surrounded this large boulder. Well, we didn't collect any artifacts, but we did note in the field this one ceramic shard, which really is quite similar to the ceramics that Kathy Crane had found and had done analysis for her MA thesis. And I did a lot of further inquiry into this and talked to a lot of experts like Phil Geib, who has done a lot of ceramic analysis, and other people like Eric Blinman. And there really is this new kind of thought about emery corrugated, because the corrugation seems to be like a tooling product, and it seems to mimic the corrugation that you see in Mesa Verde wares. Other studies have been done with Mesa Verde ceramics, and the corrugation actually has a functional aspect to it that actually helps to retain heat. But the emery corrugated doesn't seem to do that. It's just pure decoration. It's sort of, as I think Phil and I and others have talked, it's sort of like this, they're trying to mimic the form, but the functionality is kind of missing. So they just want to get the form right. But it kind of goes all together with this whole area. So, right, it's a peripheral area, they're mimicking, they're doing a lot that's similar. And to kind of add more to that conversation, I'll show you more. But here's another interesting aspect of this area. We went to this high site called the Martin's Knob, which was a site that was first investigated by George and Edna Woodbury. And their notes were really quite good. They made a really nice map of the site, and it was kind of difficult to get up to, but we got up there. It had been, when Ken Bedingfield and I went up and visited, it had been just as if the Woodburys had been there and had, as they had described it. Nothing had really changed in over 70 years. And, you know, these stone circles are very intriguing too, because they're at the high point areas surrounding these valley areas. There was another one called Talbot's circle that was identified by George and Edna Woodbury that was also on the north side. We didn't get a chance to visit that, but I know Alan Reed and others have also found some of these stone circle sites also in the Tabwatch and Cottonwood Creek areas. So what are they? Rand Grubel in his reanalysis has suggested they may be way stations, that they are signaling towers or signaling stations perhaps. Really very intriguing and I think well worth more investigation. As you can see, there are some walls as well. These are separate in that upper picture on the right of a wall. So maybe perhaps defensive. I'm not sure, but very interesting. They seem to kind of go together with this occupation in this area at this time. Some other studies that have been done on artifacts from this area. Ken Bedingfield, for his MA thesis, took some of the ceramics in this area and did what's called instrument neutron activation analysis, which is looking at the chemical signatures of the both the paste and the manufacture of some of these ceramics, and determined that, you know, about 35%, and these are sites mostly from the Cottonwood Creek area, were imported wares. So they're coming from the Southwest, they're coming from the Mesa Verde area, but there were some that were local, quite a large number of them. And likewise, this is very true too with Rand Grubel and some of his early analysis. You can find that in his published paper in 2018, but he, in 2016, had Lori Reed do some analysis of some of the ceramics, and she found that in their analysis of some of the Weimer Ranch, Cottonwood Creek areas, that there was indeed a large local production of ceramics, and that were, as she describes it, maybe best described as an emulation of northern San Juan ceramics with local materials. So we have this, again, this emulation of things further southwest, further ancestral Puebloan. So there's very clear ancestral Puebloans in this Mesa Verde area, very strong influence. It's also important to point out that this is not also that uncommon just a bit further north of the Paradox Valley area in Utah, basically at the edge of Utah and Colorado, a little bit closer to the border of Utah and Colorado, at a site called Turner Look. This is where Hannah Marie Wormington did her doctoral dissertation, and is the type site, what we call the type site for the San Rafael Fremont culture area. And here you can see she hypothesized what the house structures may have looked like. The constructions and the features are so similar to what you find in West Central Colorado. It's hard not to make the comparisons and see the correlations. Just like in other areas in West Central Colorado, at the Turner Look site, we find imported Mesa Verde wares, but also many more local produced wares that are probably just like we find in West Central Colorado, mimicked southwestern constructions. So again, we're seeing a lot of that. Well, that ancestral Puebloan influence was really far and wide. So in that first earlier map, I showed you a picture, or pointed out where Dinosaur National Monument is. There's a site there called Mantles Cave. They had a lot of perishables, so a lot of basketries and cordage and other types of materials that you don't normally find at a lot of outdoor sites. There was some recent reanalysis done by some experts in this area, and it was really found that 9 out of 25 of the baskets in this area were Fremont construction, interestingly enough. 4 comprised Fremont construction, but clearly with ancestral Puebloan decorations on them. And others, about 48%, were of ancestral Puebloan construction and decoration. So again, you know, we have sort of this wide swath of influence from the Mesa Verde area that really influenced this area. So there's a lot of trade networks. There's a lot of what we would call maybe interaction spheres. How this all occurred, I think, is really important to try to understand. There is trade here going on, clearly. There's emulation clearly going on. Dare I say, acculturation, and other influences. How much of each, I think that's still to be determined. The ceramics, we have emery corrugated and other local black and white styles, very interesting. The architecture. Architecture is very interesting, but one thing is really, really clear, is that there are no kivas in West Central Colorado, which I think is a really important point. In the Mesa Verde, the ancestral Pueblo and heartland, the kiva plays an important part of that cultural manifestation. We know that, in fact, a lot of religious activities took place in kivas. We find no kivas, or nothing that we really can recognize as kivas, in the West Central Colorado, which I think is really important. There's been a lot of postulation about there being migrations from the ancestral Puebloan area up north. However, I think it's a bit behaviorally challenging to say that that happened and they didn't bring some other aspects of their culture like the kivas. They're just not there. So kind of lends me to think that this is an indigenous manifestation, heavily influenced by Puebloan society and Pueblo culture further south. There's still continued a lot of major research discussions on this. And I would really like to highlight that a lot of this is really well summarized by my colleague, Rand Grubel, back in 2018 for an article he did for the reviews in Colorado Archaeology, where he really lays out a lot of the history. He argues for a bit of a change from Alan Reed's interpretation as gateway tradition to gateway phase. And I think that's good. I still think, however, that we need to look at, just as we do with other areas like in Mesa Verde, and really kind of think, you know, we need to look beyond our state borders and look at what's happening in Utah, what's happening in Arizona, what's happening in New Mexico. I think for this region too, we need to look at what's happening in Utah because of the discussions and the similarities of culture. And so, you know, I've advocated a lot for this, still calling it Fremont. Now, Fremont is one of those particular nomenclatures that has a lot of variability to it. A lot of people, archaeologists, find it unuseful because it has so much variability to it. There are no sites like the original Fremont site that was investigated by Earl Morris anywhere else found in Utah. None of the characteristics or the typologies or the actual things that you find at the Fremont site can you find in anywhere else. So the current understanding with Fremont is that it is a regional system with some degree of social interaction and interrelatedness. And that may sound a bit amorphous, and it is, but I do think that we still have to think about these interactions quite a bit when we're talking about West Central Colorado. And even more so as putting this presentation together, I think we can learn so much more by expanding our framework. But nevertheless, with that said, I am absolutely thrilled with the research that has been done in this area. And whether we call it Great Gateway Phase, Gateway Tradition, formative area, Fremont, whatever it is, I'm just really thrilled that we are doing research in this area. And hopefully, you know, my initial work, my archival work and artifact work has spurred some of this debate. So I'm really happy about it. So continued research realms. I see that looking at the basket maker spread is a continued research focus. We don't know particularly how this basket maker spread happened and why and what was the influence. And I think there's still a lot that could be learned. There's still a lot to learn about this interaction. You know, how did it happen? Through trade, emulation with local artifacts? We just don't know. And then, you know, finally, you know, what happened to these folks? Where's the migration? Linda McNeil and David Schall recently just published a really very fascinating article in Kiva journal that talks about southward migration and really tying this area to the ancestral Hopi, which I think is quite valid, looking at linguistic evidence and archaeology. And it's really not that far off or different from what Hannah Marie Wormington was saying, you know, when she was working at Denver Museum of Nature and Science and finishing her dissertation, was saying at the time too, that these were early folks that probably gave up their lifestyle, migrated further south into the Hopi heartland and intermingled again with the ancestral Puebloans at that time. So those are some really the key areas that I see that we can continue to do research in this area. So with that, I hope that you can see that reanalysis of artifact collections really can provide some new perspectives to archaeological problems. Now, being the state curation coordinator, I have to emphasize that we have a lot of collections, just like what you just saw, that really do need to have new analysis and new interpretations perhaps done on them, or at least revisited in some way. As the state curation coordinator, we have over 38 approved accepting repositories that have state collections. These are collections, archaeological collections that were recovered from either state, county, or local public lands over the years that remain at local repositories all across the state. And so there is a great need for new researchers, new students, new people who are in the field, or those that have the time and resources, those that can, to re-examine some of these collections. As I say, the collections care and the reanalysis is great, but the opportunities to contribute are enormous. And I think to bring it all home, we really do need to do a lot of education to the public about this and to the local communities that hold these collections. That's the emphasis that we've taken, and I think it's a really important and valid one. And maybe also involving Indigenous peoples as well in this. We need to really share this knowledge across Colorado. And there's so many new discoveries, there's so many new analysis, just as I've kind of highlighted here. And we have all that kind of information up available at our program, State Approved Museums and Cultural Repositories. So please check that out if you're a student, a researcher, or have an interest in it. And with that, I am going to stop this for a second. And again, thank you all for joining us or joining me. And I'm going to take some questions that you might have as well. So if you've got any questions you'd like to pose, I am happy to do so. I'm going to put the video back on. And if you've got a few moments left before noon and you've got some questions for me, feel free to type them up here and I'll try to answer them. But again, thank you very much for joining me.
Thanks so much for doing this, Todd. And yeah, if folks want to ask a question, if they don't want to type it in, if you'd rather ask using your microphone, you can raise your hand using the raise hand button, which you will find if you open the participants window. And then make sure you look there at the bottom for raise hand. So keep an eye out for those too.
So far, I see no questions. So either I've got everybody stumped or
they're thinking about it.
They're thinking, yeah. Okay, somebody asks, is your virtual background one of the sites you present on? And indeed it is. It actually is the Cottonwood Plebo site, that circular site. I just happen to have that available and thought, okay, I'll drop that in as my background. So yes, indeed. No other questions? If you do have any other questions, feel free to get in touch with me. Hopefully, I didn't leave my my email, but hopefully you can find that through the State Approved Museum program. There's my email address there. So feel free, if you later on think of a question you'd like to ask, feel free to do so. So another question is there current research going on in this area? To my knowledge, there isn't a lot. And I guess this is a real good challenge question because as you probably know, a lot of research today isn't done like it was with George and Edna Woodbury or Jean Eller Jensen or even C.T. Hurst. Most of the research that is done today is through compliance with the National Historic Preservation Act and Section 106 and all of that. And so the opportunities to do research in this area are kind of limited to the effects of that legislation and compliance with that. So it's important that we have kind of this understanding if we have research or projects going on to kind of try to answer some of these research questions. But mostly these types of questions and this kind of research only happens if it's initiated outside of that realm. Alan Reed and Rand Grubel have done an enormous amount of work since I published my articles and have received some grant funding to do some reanalysis of some of these sites a few years ago. So that's the most current that has come about in the field. Any other questions? Don't be shy. I hope it's been stimulating, a little bit provoking for you to think about the area as well as collections. So the same person asked, are they looking at collections or field research? And they're looking at both, actually. And actually, Rand Grubel, in his article paper for reviews of in Colorado archaeology, really did talk about the need to relook at some of the collections, both at History Colorado, but things at the C.T. Hurst Museum, which is one of our state-approved repositories. It has collections. There may be others out there as well, although we don't think that there are materials at San Diego State. I don't know if there's been an exhaustive search of that. So there might be other collections out there that we're not aware of. And so I think everybody has said, there's a need to look at collections. And there's also this need to look at the field research as well. So, yeah. Do private firms hold collections? No, they didn't. They shouldn't, I should say. Good question. So under Colorado law, anything that is found on state of Colorado land, or any subdivision of state of Colorado land, so if it's county land, if it's city land, or any local municipality, if there are archaeological collections that were excavated by permit from our office, they cannot be held by that researcher. They must be deposited at an approved repository. And likewise, if they're doing excavations on federal land or federal property, then they need to be deposited at a federal repository. It's a little bit different when we're talking about private investigations. Private landowner can hold those collections. So, but that's the exception. I may have, another question, I may have missed you saying this, so I apologize, but have you reached out to tribes directly about your interpretations and future research? Great question. I personally have not done so, and I'm hoping that maybe the future researchers will do so. But I think it's important to include those. It's been a real challenge, though, to figure out exactly whose affiliation we should be talking about, or if it's a number of different tribes. As you can see, or as I mentioned, there's a lot of indications that there may be Hopi affiliations, but clearly the Fremont has this very interesting dichotomy with it too, because there's a lot of research that suggests that they are related to the Tanoan speakers and the Kiowa. So should we be talking to the Kiowa? I'm not sure. We also have, strong historical evidence that this area was also occupied by the Utes. And it's always never easy to figure out, which groups you should be talking to. And of course, there's a lot of tribes that could be very interested in all of this. So, but I would love to do more interactions with the indigenous descendant groups if I could.